In this section, we're going to take a look at some of the early development of the raiders and invaders that come into Europe. Now, this is not new. We'd seen earlier in the late Roman Empire a significant number of peoples move in from Asia, conquer large chunks of territory, and move on in the case of the Vandals, or settle from moving from one part of Europe to another in the case of the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, who had left mainland Europe and spent some time sailing to England and settling there. What we're going to start to look at now is the idea that late Roman Empire, remember, had all those different invasions, and there are now other waves that are going to be coming in. And this is going to be now taking us to the time period of the challenges of the Magyars and the Vikings and Muslim raiders as they go in and out of the edges of Europe. And the key element here to think about is, as these are taking place, are these for raid purposes only, grab and go, or are they for permanent settlement? Are people looking for a new place to live? For example, when we take a look at the Vikings, we'll see a lot of different reactions as to sometimes the first wave of Viking activity is simply a raid. They come, they break things, they steal things, they leave. Later on, though, that's going to lead to settlement. They're going to come and stay and settle large areas in places like Normandy in France, and later on in much of northern England too. They're going to come and go from being raiders to being settlers, and this is going to take place over much of the 9th and 10th centuries as we look at the way that Europe is going to have to deal with these outsiders coming in and upsetting. This is a simple map showing you some Viking activity and the time frame of the various raids and when they were going. Notice here, though, that the Vikings are using waterborne transport wherever they go. If they can access something by water, they can get there. So they are, in this case, traveling all the way from the main area where they're from in Scandinavia. They're heading out across the Atlantic, noticing that they're investigating and settling various islands, including getting all the way to North America in a very short time period as they travel, and settling many of these places as they go. There are also activities where the Vikings, after they've headed that direction, are also going to be heading eastward, following the rivers into what you know as modern-day Finland and Russia, and going down through the different river valleys and founding various civilizations and taking over them as they go. Excuse me. What's also interesting is that the Vikings will continue to explore along the coastline and go many different places. In essence, as a raiding community, as a group of united warriors who are looking for adventure, they're looking for loot, they're looking for slaves, they're looking for all kinds of opportunities, economic and otherwise, you can see how this relatively flimsy little boat, a Viking longboat, would be a very easy to use vehicle to get around shallow water and to get around in upriver valleys and to sail short distances. There's a sail that could be raised in the middle, as well as oars that could be used. And they're very hardy in the sense that they're willing to go very long distances in these boats and very rigorously go after whatever they wished, whether it was slaves or raiding a Christian monastery for jewels. This would be the vehicle that they would use, and they could go far, they could go fast. And it was one of the things that was really scary to many Europeans, is how quickly the Vikings could move. They could be there not 1 minute and turn around, they are there. This is one of the things that makes them essentially a very powerful force. As they're leaving and Scandinavia and going elsewhere, their unpredictable but also brutal military nature is revealed to the Europeans. So in the case of the Vikings, we're going to go from raiding to settlement, and there's going to be long-term Viking settlement in Ireland, in England, in France, also in Russia and other places. That's going to be taking their Norwegian and Scandinavian, Swedish, Danish ideas and exporting them to many places in the world. Some places like Greenland and Iceland and the islands of the North Atlantic will remain Viking sort of colonies and enclaves all the way until the modern era. Other places the Vikings are going to be going, they're going to intermingle with the local peoples and largely die out over time by simply being absorbed. There were a small number of them, and they get absorbed into the larger communities that they settle. We'll see that, for example, with the Vikings who get involved in working in what is the modern Ukraine, what will be called Rus. Okay, the city and the area around Kiev will at one point in time be heavily occupied by these Viking invaders. But there are other groups that are going to challenge the way the Europeans operate. The Magyars, sometimes referred to as the Huns, they're going to be coming out of Europe at roughly the same time, or coming into Europe about the same time, but they're coming out of Central Asia. These are warriors mostly on horseback. They speak a very distinct language that is not like any other European language around them. They come in, they raid, but then eventually they take over the Hungarian plain. The area near the Danube River that is now modern-day Hungary. This is where they come in and they settle and eventually are slowly converted to Roman Catholicism over time, Christianized and integrated into the larger community. Same sort of thing had happened with the Vikings. Originally a non-Christian people with their own belief systems, they increasingly, as they came into contact with Christian Europeans, were over time slowly converted to Christianity and in that process integrated more into the European context of society and culture and taxation and military affairs. So this Viking expansionism was something that was a threat. It was very much a threat to the people who were raided and invaded. There's lots of different chronicles by various peoples in Europe attesting to the brutality of these Viking raids, their sort of grab-and-go mentality and the vicious nature of them. And then later on, as the Vikings come and settle and are slowly Christianized, they are converted back over to a much more settlement mentality and will still live on in Europe, but not be the vicious Viking raiders of the first generation. The other group that is also in this time frame a significant threat to Europe are Muslim raiders, both as terms of pirates, but also in terms of, remember, by the year 711, when we showed you the size of the Umayyad Caliphate, that green map we just looked at, the Muslim forces have conquered all the way up into the edge of France and occasionally send out raiders into France and into northern Spain on land. There's also some piracy amongst Muslim forces on the Mediterranean. They occupy many of the islands in the Mediterranean Sea, and they make an active effort and they go and conquer Sicily as well. So there are multiple ways in which the Europe in the time period after Charlemagne is very much a state, an area of siege. There's a significant slowdown in long-distance trade activity. There's an increase in the need for security, and there's an increase in the idea that there's these outside invaders, and we have to look to somebody to provide us protection against them, whether they be Muslim pirates, Magyars, or Vikings. There is a change where many people in Europe are feeling very threatened, and that in order to secure themselves, they're going to have to think of some strategies of how they can resist the outsider who is coming in or find some place of safety with their local lord. One way to do that, and this is a highly stylized map, and it might be a little difficult to see, but what we're going to be talking about here is sort of the creation of what some historians are going to refer to as feudalism, or others are going to refer to it as manorialism. And that is the idea of how are many people in Europe going to be put into a position where they surrender their freedom as free workers and end up working on the land of somebody else in some sort of servile status, sometimes as a serf or sometimes as an abject slave, if not a hired hand. This stylized sign or this stylized manner here is trying to show you that when the new Europeans are looking at security issues, surrounded by enemies, threatened by Vikings, Magyars, and Muslims, many people are willing to trade, even though they don't like it. They're going to be forced into situations where in order to have better security, they're going to turn themselves and their labor over to the elite who do have fortress facilities to protect people, who are building what are sort of the earliest versions of fortresses or castles, and who have the military training to help protect the people against the outside invader, whether it be a foreigner or the next landlord who's grasping for territory. This system, and you'll see some kind of explanation in your textbook under the idea of manorialism. Okay? Or you can see it under the idea of feudalism. In each case, what you want to think about is they're telling you how there is a dramatic economic and social change in early medieval Europe, where people who were potentially open, free Farmers doing their own thing are now increasingly going to surrender themselves over to the military authorities who can help them. And over time, a system is going to be created to understand how to use this territory, who gets to use it, and who gets to use it, and how and why. So let's take a second here to take a look at some very basic vocabulary that you're going to see somehow reflected in the reading that you're going to be looking at. We're trying to give you some terminology that's very specific to help you understand how this very new economic and social and military system is working. A couple of things here. A fief is a piece of territory, okay? A chunk of land, a farm, that is owned by somebody, and they're going to allow somebody to live and work on it or use it who is going to be their vassal. So essentially one way to put this is, if you want to, you can think of like the owner of the fief is the landlord, and the vassal is the person who is living and working in somebody else's space. They don't own it, but they're responsible for maintaining it, and essentially pay their landlord not with cash, but by producing food and providing services to the landlord in terms of labor and that sort of thing. Now, this is then a system where there is somebody who owns the territory and controls it, a lord in the words of the time period. And what you do is, when you want to use a piece of land from your landlord, instead of signing a lease, that would be something we do, you do an act of homage. You go and have a public ceremony where you swear in open places with witnesses that you will fulfill the duties of your landlord and that you will do as you are told, in compensation for which you get to live and work on that territory and make a living. These are oftentimes referred to as creating manors. This is essentially a large farm, if you want to think of it that way, where there's a lot of people working. Most of them are not free labor. They're there, they're forced to be there. They are serfs or slaves. Some people are free peasants, but there's not as many of them as there used to be. And they are working on the field of the landlord producing food. Depending on where you are in Europe, there are two different systems by which they use agricultural property. One is called the two-field system, the other is called the three-field system. Let me just, for the sake of example, use the three-field system that you saw in that earlier graphic. What it means is that there is a farming territory. 2 out of every 3 years, the land is being used for food production directly, intensively used for food production. While the third year, the other third of the property is left what's called fallow. And what that means is it is not being used for intensive agriculture. It's being used as perhaps pasturage, and it's allowing the land to recover. For some of you who know just basic ideas of gardening and botany, you cannot plant the same thing in the same soil every year without replacing the nutrients in the soil. You just exhaust the soil. Europeans in many places have already discovered that they can't grow food on the same piece of property 3 years in a row. They'll do it 2 out of 3 and then skip a year and help the soil recover, especially if they're using it for pasturage, because as the animals are on the pasture eating, they're leaving behind their manure, which of course is the next ingredient necessary to enriching the soil to help it recover and be more productive in the future. So they have started to figure out that they can't use all their territory all the time for food production. There are times when you just can't. Also, what's happening in Europe is, as the people and the population are expanding, they're starting to chop down more forests. They're using more territory further down in the river valley on the floodplain that's subject to problems of flooding. They're trying to plant and grow food higher up the mountainsides where the frosts come earlier because of the elevation. In other words, the more we look at the European expansion of the territory they're using for agriculture, the more we can see signs that they are overextending themselves. There is not the ability to continue this growth sustainably. They're starting to max out on the territory and property they can use, and that's going to, in the long term, mean that there is in a biological sense, a carrying capacity. There's a certain maximum amount of people that you can put on a piece of territory and have enough food for all, let alone have issues with droughts or famine. But nonetheless, Europe is growing, the population is going up, and it's increasingly using more and more territory that's not the best and most suitable for agriculture, but they try to use it because of the population. The other things that are happening on this manor is, not only are the people who are serfs working for their landlord, They're told what to do. They also have some territories where they work on the land for themselves and for their own family. So they're doing work for the landlord, they're doing some work for themselves, but all the territory they're working on is not their own, it's the landlord's. And instead of paying like a cash rent for working on the land of the Lord, instead they use sweat equity. They're working in the Lord's fields and providing him or her with a cut of the crop. Some of you from American history might think of the idea of sharecropping. Somebody's working on somebody else's land and sharing the crop with the owner of the land as their rent. That's the same kind of idea you see here. What's also interesting is that within the community, there are lots of things where the people living on the manor are paying all different kinds of taxes and fees of various kind. Not only do they turn over part of their crop to their landlord, but say every time they use the olive press or the grinding stone for grain. There's lots of different fees that the landlord continually collects. They're a form of taxation, of course, and they are much resented by many people, and we'll get back to that as we move into the Middle Ages. But one of the key elements that's going to be very difficult for many people is increasingly there is a tithe. That's a 10% tax on much agricultural production in Europe. It's collected by the local church. And so as we get into the Middle Ages and we talk some more about open rebellions of various kinds and peasant and slave unrest in places in Europe, we're going to also have to include that oftentimes local churchmen and churchwomen who are also landlords, who are also collecting taxes, will be involved in those rebellions. Not only is the landlord going to be a target, but sometimes the church or churchwomen are going to be a target as well. And then, of course, we have this last sort of series of ideas where the labor system in Europe is going to be changing. We're going to go from a period where there is extensive slavery to a period of a lot of free peasants, and then back into a system where they are serfs. Serfs are different from slaves in the sense that slaves are simple property. They can be sold any way which form the owner chooses, like a tool. A serf, on the other hand, lives and works on the same land their entire life. They cannot be separated from it. The ideas that we're going for here at the end is that the Europe of the late Middle Ages is going to be very different from the one we're talking about now in the early Middle Ages. There's been a significant uptick in what's called manorialism and feudalism. The economy is changing, land and labor systems are changing, and we're starting to create a world that you're going to recognize as a medieval world with lots of interesting aspects to it. Don't be intimidated by some of the vocabulary of some of those specific terms. Take a look at your book, take a look at your notes here, and see if you can make sure that you piece together the key elements here. And then, of course, as always, take a look at some of the essay or the extra questions and practice questions that can help you comprehend.